Hello, and welcome to this presentation in human physiology applied to the practice of medicine. Our subject today is the oxygen transport system, also known as the oxygen cascade. You can, of course, get all this information from books, but what I want to give you is a sense of how interesting, how important, how fascinating, even how exciting this study can be when put in its proper context. In fact, I want to infect you with my enthusiasm for this wonderful subject. I want to give you a sense of how profound this subject is for humans, and so I will frequently refer to the evolutionary events, the things that shaped life on this planet and made us the way we are, and it's all about oxygen. And if you ever aspire to be a competent physician who can care for unstable and critically ill patients, this is essential information that you need. So for more on oxygen and its evolutionary significance, refer to part 1 of this talk, a separate video that I produced earlier. So as I said in previous videos, the oxygen transport system is quite simply a system for transporting oxygen from the air around us to the mitochondrion inside us, to generate energy needed to support life. So how much oxygen is in the atmosphere, in the air around us? And how do we work all this out? So what's this? Yes, this is the atmosphere. It's the only one we have, and so we have to protect it. But I digress. So air is a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen in a 79 to 21% ratio. But for simplicity, let's approximate to 80-20% ratio. Now, atmospheric pressure has traditionally been measured in millimeters of mercury. Many of you will remember from high school physics or even from earth science that a pressure of 1 atmosphere in millimeters of mercury is about 767, but of course it varies. So let's approximate for simplicity to a total atmospheric pressure of 750 millimeters of mercury. But of course, oxygen's not responsible for all of this pressure. It's only partially responsible. There's an important word. Partially responsible. So how much of the 750 millimeters of mercury is due to oxygen? It's common knowledge that we breathe in 21% oxygen. But when we look at an arterial blood gas result, we see that oxygen is measured in millimeters of mercury ppA, and it means partial pressure in arterial blood, ppA. Well, this is in fact the language used by blood gas labs of all hospitals around the country and around the world. So perhaps we better get used to using it too. Medical students and new residents seem to have great difficulty with the conversion of one unit to the other. It really seems to be beyond them. But it's really so very simple. So for consistency, millimeters of mercury partial pressure are the units we should use when we consider how much oxygen is all around us and how much of it is successfully being transported around the body to different locations. Now, who's this guy? I'm sure you don't recognize him. He isn't well known, but he really should be. This guy was a 19th century genius. And guess what? He was a clergyman. He was a genius and something of a rock star of his time. An incredible researcher in chemistry, in physics, even in meteorology. And he actually introduced atomic theory into the practice of chemistry and made it make good sense. Not bad for a country vicar. His name is John Dalton, 1766 to 1844. And if you remember your high school physics, he discovered and published Dalton's law of partial pressures. Now, back then, when the starving poor were fighting to get enough food to live on, and the wealthy and the clergy endowed with a parish living were the only members of society with the financial security to pursue hobbies such as scientific research. And John Dalton pursued it extremely successfully. Now, let's get back to the atmosphere and atmospheric pressure, which of course varies from day to day with the weather, but I've decided for ease of calculation that we're going to make one atmosphere approximately 750 millimeters of mercury. Now, oxygen is present in the atmosphere here on Earth at 21%, but once again, for ease of calculation, let's round it off to 20%. Now, oxygen is not responsible for the entire atmospheric pressure. It is only partially responsible. There's that word again. It's responsible for a fraction of the total, which is 1/5 of the total pressure. See the accompanying diagram right here. 1/5 of 750 millimeters of mercury is 150 millimeters. So this is the partial or fractional pressure existing in the atmosphere attributable to the oxygen molecules. Actually, if we use the exact numbers, it turns out to be about 157.6 millimeters of mercury, to be precise. And what we've just done is to apply Dalton's law of partial pressures. That's why this law is so very important. This scientific genius, John Dalton, stated that the partial pressure attributed to a single gas in any gas mixture is proportional to its fraction in the mixture, what we call today its molar fraction in that mixture. Well, this is pretty intuitive, isn't it? Right? So 150 millimeters mercury pressure is of course an approximation, but it serves our purpose as well. So let's start with oxygen's journey through the body, which of course begins in our lungs. So what's the partial pressure of oxygen in our lungs? So that's a pretty difficult question. We might need help here. So let's ask another genius, a 1980s musical genius, him. When we breathe in the words of this guy, who sounds like pretty much of an expert, Gordon Sumner, also known as Sting, the original version of this famous song was, I think, to the best of my memory, every breath we take contains a partial pressure of oxygen of 150 millimeters of mercury. If the atmospheric pressure of oxygen is 150 millimeters of mercury, then this is what we breathe in, and then Sting and I propose to you that this should be the oxygen partial pressure in the alveolus. Well, I suppose we could, of course, both be mistaken. A partial pressure of oxygen of 150 millimeters of mercury would seem to make sense, wouldn't it? However, like many things in clinical medicine and in physiology, just because we think it's logical doesn't make it so. So, let's look at this in more detail. Now, remember, back in medical school or college, how your eminent professors of respiratory physiology told you that the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood was 100 millimeters of mercury. And we see this on the blood gas form. Look at this. These professors, such as the one here to the right, insisted that the alveolar capillary membrane was superbly adapted to its function. It is so thin that it presents no barrier to the passage of oxygen into the blood. They said that this membrane was a perfect membrane for the diffusion of gases. This is really important. Also, we were told that the lungs' capacity for gas exchange was massive because the surface area of both the lungs together was approximately the same size as a tennis court. I mean, can you believe that? The same size as a tennis court? It is quite amazing. Well, this immediately presents a bit of a paradox, because if the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus is 150 millimeters of mercury, and yet in the arterial blood it's only 100 millimeters of mercury, well, to me, this does not look like a perfectly adapted physiological mechanism for the transport of oxygen into the blood. It's a drop. It's a drop from 150 down to 100. It's a huge drop. Well, have these brilliant professors of respiratory physiology been lying to us? Probably not. Or were they just mistaken? Well, I'm sure you realise that neither is the case. So before we decide that everything we learned in respiratory physiology is complete rubbish, let's take a good long look at what might be happening here. Okay? It's important and we need to look at this in detail. Well, the obvious place to start is, of course, the alveolus. Is the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus really 150 millimeters of mercury? What other gases could be present? We know that there's a lot of nitrogen, and this is present in the atmosphere at about 80%. And so, by Dalton's law of partial pressures, the nitrogen is 600 millimeters of mercury. But of course, the pulmonary blood flow is bringing other stuff back to the alveolus all the time. Such as, what else is it bringing back, guys? It's carbon dioxide, yes. Carbon dioxide is coming back to the alveolus, so there has to be some carbon dioxide gas in the alveolar gas. Now indulge me for a moment and just try this. Put your hand close to your mouth and exhale into the palm of your hand. What do you feel? Yes, your breath is warm, but more importantly, what else can you feel? It feels really moist, right? The gas in your expired respiratory gases are very moist. They're laden with moisture. There's a lot of water vapor in expired gas, and so oxygen has to share the alveolar space with a lot of nitrogen, significant amounts of carbon dioxide, and a whole lot of water vapor. In fact, in the alveolus, the gases are highly saturated water, sometimes close to the saturated vapor pressure of water. And this is why, without mechanisms to reclaim this water, a lot of water can be lost in your expired respiratory gases from your respiratory tract. In patients with tracheostomies and laryngostomies whose tracheal secretions dry out, it can be very difficult for the patients to cough up these dried secretions because they're very dry because of lots and lots of water loss. Well, now, let's get back to the alveolus. So what's the partial pressure of carbon dioxide returning to the lungs? Let's check that blood gas again. Well, it shows that it's 40 millimeters of mercury in arterial blood, and it has to be a bit higher in venous blood. In fact, we know from the experts that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the venous blood and in the alveolus is approximately 45 millimeters of mercury. But of course, this doesn't displace only oxygen, it's displacing all the other gases as well. As nitrogen and oxygen are present in the ratio of 4:1, it seems logical that CO2 will displace 4 times more nitrogen than oxygen. Water vapor will do exactly the same thing. So, only about 20% of the total of these gases and vapors actually displace some oxygen. In fact, there are so many gases competing for space in the alveolus that the partial pressure of oxygen is actually much lower than 150 millimeters of mercury. It's approximately 105 millimeters of mercury. And of course, this is a very variable number from individual to individual, but 105 millimeters of mercury is fairly representative. Even so, if the partial pressure is 105 millimeters of mercury, we still have to doubt those eminent respiratory physiologists who said that the gas exchange in the alveolus was perfect. Now, I know this looks like I'm being picky, being a little bit obsessional, and I hate to be a pain about this, but they said gas exchange was perfect. But if it's 100 when it should be 105, this is not perfect. What's going on? Well, the blood leaving the alveolus is at a point in the circulation that we call the pulmonary end capillary. Then it quickly enters the pulmonary veins, from where it goes to the left atrium, and then to the left ventricle, and then to the aorta to supply the entire body. So let's just assume our professors were telling the truth. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt, and we'll assume that the partial pressure of oxygen in the pulmonary end capillary blood is 105. Then, if by the time it gets to the radial artery it's only 100, then where did some of the oxygen go? When I ask this question to medical students and residents, many of them assume that oxygen is being consumed, and it's probably being consumed by the blood vessels, by the endothelium of the vessels. On the face of it, seems like a perfectly reasonable explanation, but again, being reasonable or logical just isn't enough to make it a fact. So again, let's consider this whole area in a bit more detail. The above explanation assumes that the endothelium of the blood vessels is lacking in oxygen, and when well oxygenated blood is in the vicinity, that oxygen will simply diffuse off its hemoglobin in the lumen of the artery and into the endothelial cells. Well, physiologically, can oxyhemoglobin do this? Can oxygen dissociate from its hemoglobin simply when there is a favourable partial pressure gradient, or if you prefer, a favourable concentration gradient in the presence of a low partial pressure, presumably in the blood vessel walls? If this were the case, what are the implications? Well, we know that Japanese pearl divers can hold their breath for many, many minutes and can tolerate hypoxia for quite a time. Just follow me here, this is important. There are, however, some people even better than pearl divers at holding their breath. Like this guy, David Blaine, who can hold his breath a really, really long time. Or this guy, a German called Tom Sietis, who holds the official world record for breath holding underwater, 22 minutes and 22 seconds. Can you believe it? During this time, these guys must become profoundly hypoxemic. Profoundly hypoxemic. So, what if hypoxemia alone is enough to cause the release of oxygen from hemoglobin? Then any time a person, such as one of our patients, became hypoxemic, or for it happens with Tom Sietis when he holds his breath, it would cause hemoglobin to give up lots of oxygen, and we would have oxygen gas bubbles in the aorta because oxygen would come out of solution and cause these gas bubbles, and if these go to the brain and the heart, this would cause stroke and heart attack and will probably kill the person very quickly, just like occurs in the bends in deep sea divers, because oxygen will exceed its solubility product in the water of our bloodstream. But this never happens to David Blaine or to Tom Sietis or to the pearl divers, and this is because hemoglobin holds onto its oxygen very tightly, even in the presence of hypoxemia, until it gets some very specific signals to release its oxygen. And hypoxia or hypoxemia or low partial pressures of oxygen are just not a major trigger to the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. So this cannot explain the discrepancy between the 105 millimeters of mercury of oxygen in the pulmonary and capillary blood and only 100 millimeters of mercury in the aorta. In fact, oxygenated hemoglobin is a massively sophisticated molecule, and in the arteries it never gives up its oxygen in this way. We'll come back to that shortly, but now let's get back to oxygen's journey through the cardiovascular system. In fact, we know that some blood enters the pulmonary veins from a source other than the pulmonary capillaries. In fact, venous blood is entering from systemic capillaries. But which ones? So, come on guys, I think you guys know this. I'm sure you know this, you just have to think. Okay? Yes, it's the bronchial veins, which drain deoxygenated systemic venous blood into the oxygenated blood from the pulmonary and capillary. And this lowers the overall partial pressure of oxygen in the pulmonary veins. Does this happen anywhere else? Well, let's think about it. When the blood arrives in the left ventricle, some very desaturated venous blood from the myocardium passes into the ventricular cavity from tiny little myocardial veins instead of draining into the coronary sinus. Now, I'm pretty sure you also know the names for these veins. Yep, I know, it's there, it's on the tip of your tongue, isn't it? They drain into the left ventricular cavity, adding very desaturated, very deoxygenated venous blood into the arterial blood in the left ventricle, again decreasing the partial pressure of oxygen slightly, and these are called, yes, the Thebesian veins. Now you're kicking yourself, aren't you? You knew it all the time. The addition of bronchial venous blood takes the partial pressure of oxygen down from, say, 105 down to approximately 103. And the addition of Thebesian venous blood takes it down from 103 to, say, approximately 100 millimeters of mercury. So, at first we thought that oxygen partial pressure was decreasing because oxygen was being taken out of the blood and being used. But look, clearly this is not the case. It's clear what's going on here. The mechanism is that very, very deoxygenated blood is actually being added to the oxygenated blood, thus decreasing down or diluting down the total partial pressure of oxygen slightly, but very, very significantly. In any body position, there are also a small number of dependent or basal alveoli which are very hypoventilated. These alveoli may be compressed or may have a degree of atelectasis, and so maybe don't contain as much oxygen as they should. So they may only have a partial pressure of oxygen of, say, 70 millimeters of mercury. And so this is the maximum value, or the maximum partial pressure of oxygen in the blood that can leave these alveoli in the pulmonary and capillary blood. What we're talking about here is, of course, you've heard this term before, guys, shunt, anatomical shunt. Some systemic venous blood does not return to the lungs for oxygenation. It drains directly into the pulmonary veins or directly into the left ventricular cavity, and we call this shunt. Well, to me, this seems like a pretty major design flaw. So how big of a problem is this for the body? How much of the cardiac output goes through shunt and doesn't see any oxygen? Let's do a quick, admittedly approximate calculation. If the partial pressure in arterial blood should be 105 millimeters mercury, and yet it's only 100, then as a rough approximation, the proportion of blood flowing through the shunt has to be something like 105 minus 100 divided by 105, which is approximately 4.5 to 5%. So let's give credit where credit is due. Our professors of respiratory physiology were absolutely right. The partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus is 105, and it is exactly the same value of 105 in pulmonary and capillary blood. And so yes, the alveolar capillary membrane is a perfect design for gas exchange, and the lungs can provide a massive degree of gas exchange per minute. This venous admixture is, of course, not the lungs' fault. It's a cardiovascular thing. This blood goes through the heart, and by the time it leaves the aorta, the partial pressure has decreased to approximately 100 millimeters of mercury. So then this blood arrives in the radial artery, and what happens to the oxygen here in the periphery? Well, we'll have to wait and see, because in preparation for the next part of the journey, I want to say a few words about the structure and function of hemoglobin, and then we'll be in a good position to tackle the important topic that is the rest of the journey of oxygen in part 3 of this talk.